Welcome to Anti-Aging Unraveled with Dr. Lori Gerber. The body is one of the most complicated systems in the universe. Dr. Gerber and her guests explore integrative medicine and cosmetic dermatology, combining traditional medicine, alternative health practices, new innovations, and technology, which work together to help you look and feel natural and age gracefully. Now, here is your host, Dr. Lori Gerber.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Anti-Aging Unraveled. I have a great show for everybody tonight, and I'm excited about it because I think in this world that we live in right now, it has a huge relevance about stress and inflammation and how it affects different parts of our body. We're going to talk a lot about something called the HPA axis. And hopefully, by the time you guys are done listening, you'll have a good understanding of what that means and how to fix it. Or maybe not fix it, but at least help it. So, I'm going to introduce our guest today. It's Stacy Smith, one of my favorite professions in the world. She is a chiropractor from the National University of Health Sciences in Illinois. And she has 2 bachelor degrees of science. So I'm a little jealous of that: biochemistry and human biology, one from Michigan State and the other one from NUHS. And not only that, all of her family are chiropractors, her parents, her brother. So for 16 years, she had what I would say a more well rounded vision of medicine from a traditional practitioner, which is why I went to DO school, honestly. So she shares some of the same ideals and continues to work on different coursework and functional medicine to help just bring this to light to the community. And her background really is going to be a wealth of knowledge to us. So without further ado, Miss Stacy, I want to say hi.
Hi, Dr. Gerber. Thank you so much for having me and for the great introduction. It's nice to be here tonight.
You're welcome. No problem. So as I was saying, chiropractic, to me, honestly, I never knew about DO, which for those of you who don't know means doctor of osteopathy. So um, before I knew about DO school, I was looking into chiropractic school because I just felt that we were just looking at medicine in a whole wrong direction. So, I'm really excited to explain to everybody what we're going to talk about today and, how stress and this thing called the HPA axis, which sounds so complicated, um, creates inflammation and what stressors cause all this. So, if we could maybe just start with explaining what the HPA axis is.
Yeah, so the HPA axis, it stands for hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis. So what happens is the hypothalamus will receive signals of stress, different types of stress on the body, right? So when we think of stress, we typically think of mental and emotional stress, but there's a lot more to it than that. Actually, you can think about blood sugar as being a stressor. Cortisol is a glucocorticoid. So that definitely plays a role if people are having issues with their diet, eating high sugar meals or skipping meals, things like that, traveling, those kinds of things. Also, inflammation can cause stress on the body. So inflammation can come from everything from rheumatoid arthritis, to food allergies and other underlying infections that I'm sure Dr. Gerber can go into great extent about. And then another main bucket of stress that I highlight for patients too is sleep disturbances. And this is going to be, we call it social jet lag, but it can be regular jet lag from traveling. It could be shift work. It could be just issues falling asleep because you're stressed out, or trouble staying asleep, which we have to dive a little bit deeper into what's causing that. So those are the 4 main buckets that we focus on as far as stress affecting the HPA axis. And once the HPA recognizes stress, it will, the hypothalamus will filter that, and then it receives that stress signal and it releases what we call CRH, which is corticotropin releasing hormone. That then triggers the pituitary gland to secrete ACTH, which is called adrenocorticotropin hormone. And then that in turn flows through the circulation to trigger the adrenal cortex to release cortisol, and then of course DHEA as well, which helps to counteract that. So so that's the HPA in a nutshell. Like I said, it's any kind of stress placed on the body. It can come from external stress, internal stress, and you know, any repercussions from infections and inflammation.
So let's, I'm going to put this a little more simply for you guys. You know, we have this cortisol stuff, right? And the cortisol is really what drives so many systems in our body. So when you were talking about insulin, I mean, I like to tell patients all the time, it's like putting a diabetic on steroids and watching their sugars go up, right? When we don't have this regulation of our cortisol system, there's so many consequences, right? Um, so what would a patient feel if they were having what I would say cortisol dysfunction or HPA axis dysfunction?
So a couple different things. You know, the cortisol has a regular rhythm throughout the day, and it's higher in the morning, and it decreases as the day goes on, because what cortisol does is it gives us energy and it helps us wake up, right? It actually increases, and then at its peak is when we're awake and we're alert. And then it decreases throughout the day. So if you're having cortisol issues, you can either have, you know, high cortisol, which is going to cause anxiety. It's going to cause you to feel wired. It's going to maybe give you a sense of overwhelm. And then if cortisol is low, you'll experience fatigue, which is why, you know, a lot of people have chronic fatigue. And that's when we would want to look at their cortisol levels and see, you know, where they are in that. I always call it the cortisol continuum, right? Like, are you high? Are you low? Are you fluctuating? You know, if it's really low in the morning and it's supposed to be high, you're waking up. And I always like to look at the concept of, you know, if people are waking up and they don't feel well rested, most people are looking at their thyroid. Well, we need to look at their HPA axis and how it's functioning, their cortisol levels too, right? So that's one of the main indicators to me is either anxiety and overwhelm and moodiness, or the fatigue and exhaustion and that chronic burnout.
What about weight? I get that a lot, right? You know,
Yeah.
I have a lot of athletes too, so I know many of them are tuning in, and I already got one question from Facebook, and it was basically, you know, how we're going to get to testing, but you know, I can't seem to lose weight. I'm training for an Ironman, and what's going on? Because, you know, I'm exhausted, but I'm giving myself rest. What's the deal? And then by the same token, there's people that aren't athletes that say, I just can't lose weight.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So stress on the body, like we said, comes from many different sources, and working out is one of them. Playing sports and working out to an extreme. Now, it's kind of entertaining that, you know, we talk about that. You know, I used to do triathlons, sprint triathlons, not Ironman triathlons. But you know, when you're training, you should really be looking at giving your body that time to repair as well, because when you exercise, your cortisol increases, and if you are exercising on a regular basis and you're not giving your body that time to heal and repair in between your workouts and doing your stretching and your, you know, trigger point therapy, massage, whatever, you know, you're doing in between, Epsom salt baths, all the big names, right? You know, that's definitely something that we look into in our athletes. And then, like you said, you know, for our non-athletes that are having difficulty losing weight, you know, increased cortisol causes truncal obesity, which is belly fat, and, you know, the flank fat that, you know, we all called muffin top, right? So that belly fat, it's kind of the same concept I try to explain to people. If you're familiar with people taking like prednisone or something, and if they're on it for long periods of time for an autoimmune issue, they'll actually get that moon face. So that can happen as well. So yeah, cortisol is definitely something that plays a role. not just in holding on to fat because your body feels like it's in danger, right? That's why we release cortisol. It's the stress response. So, we're in everyday society stress, but our body thinks that we're being chased by a tiger all day long. Whether you're right.
Yeah.
And so whether you're in a traffic jam or you're not eating your meals regularly and timing them, if you're over exercising, under exercising, whatever the case may be, you're putting stress on your body. Your body doesn't understand why it's stressed out or where it's coming from. It just knows it's under stress. So it's looking and holding on to, increasing that stress response, but holding on to the fat as well. And cortisol suppresses thyroid hormone and sex hormones. So, getting into the weeds of like fertility issues and things, that's a whole nother topic, right?
Yeah, that was actually a question. So you can keep rolling a little bit with it.
Yeah. So cortisol actually suppresses thyroid stimulating hormone release, which is TSH, which people will get tested if they get their thyroid tested. And it also suppresses T4 to T3 conversion. So, when people go and they get their thyroid hormone tested, I always recommend that they also get their antibodies tested, of course, to make sure that that's, it's not Hashimoto's or, on the verge of it. There could be underlying infections that could be causing all those issues as well, and increase in antibodies, gluten, all that fun stuff. But, looking at the HPA axis is very important when you're looking at thyroid issues, because, if you start replacing thyroid hormone, but you don't fix the HPA axis and the cortisol and DHEA and that whole system with lifestyle management and potential some nutrients to help you with stress management, you're definitely maybe missing a piece of the puzzle, right?
Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah.
Yeah. And then in the same respect, it's also then if your body is under stress from infections or from working out or from, all the like sleep disturbances, whatever, you're going to like your body wants to get away from danger before it reproduces, right? Like the immediate concern is to live.
Right. Not how to
So right, yeah. So reproduction is not our high priority, it's survival.
Right.
And so we're going to be creating cortisol and using all our precursor nutrients to make sure that happens, and staying in that like fight and flight sympathetic nervous system response instead of using that energy and precursor nutrients and production for the sex hormones. So that's where then we can start having imbalances with, estrogens and progesterone and testosterone. And then you can look at neurotransmitters as well, and the imbalance there. And then, you look at all these mood issues and you're like, okay, well, is it coming from neurotransmitter imbalance? Is it coming from cortisol? Is it coming from sex hormones? Like, yes, and yes, right.
I actually think that's you hit the nail on the head. And I had a bunch of lab reviews today. And I think that one of the key points to take home for people that are listening is thyroid can be directly related to cortisol, right? Because it's just the way that it works with the suppression. So you need to check TSH, T3, T4 antibodies to get the real picture of what's going on. I wish it was TSH was in isolation, and people just say, well, my doctor checked my TSH and it was fine. I never understood, even in med school, why we were just checking a TSH. It didn't make sense to me. Well, one, it's really not a thyroid hormone, right? I mean, let's be honest.
Right.
It's what stimulates production, but it's not the thyroid hormone. And, there's so many things that go into being able to convert your thyroid hormone into activated hormone. And not only, the cortisol response, but nutrients and all that other, or we can get into gut. But, I think that's really important to understand that thyroid can be directly related to cortisol and HPA axis dysfunction. And I do a lot of hormone therapy, and if you do not correct the cortisol, you are never going to make them feel better because you're always robbing Peter to pay Paul.
Absolutely.
Always.
Yeah.
So, I always say to people, look, I actually use a spider web, a really old steroid spider web in my descriptions when I'm explaining to patients. I say, all right, here's cortisol at the top. Here's your sex hormones, right? And actually, here's cholesterol. Here's cortisol. Here's your sex hormones. What happens if we remove cholesterol, right? We take that out of the picture. That always makes me laugh, right? We take cholesterol, we want to make it as low as possible. Everything suffers. We take cortisol out of the picture. Everything suffers. And you're robbing one side to make the other. And you're right. You're always pulling from to essential life processes. You're always trying to make your body function, not reproduce. Reproduction is a luxury to your body. So you're always going to rob Peter to pay Paul until it can't keep up anymore, right? And then the cortisol just drops. So that's probably, I think, why people get a little bit confused by the term adrenal fatigue. And I want to just touch on and I use it too because I think, it was kind of ingrained in us for a long time what adrenal fatigue is versus HPA axis dysfunction. And I think you said it best, the continuum, but maybe we can elaborate a little bit. I think it goes from high to low on the cortisol spectrum, and why
Mhm.
adrenal fatigue might be kind of an antiquated or a term that really doesn't make sense anymore.
Yeah, I mean, so we usually talk about adrenal fatigue because we're thinking about this in terms of the actual adrenal gland itself. Um, because that's the hormone that we're testing, right? And cortisol comes from the adrenal gland. So we're thinking, well, if cortisol comes from the adrenal gland, then it's the adrenal gland's fault that cortisol isn't being produced in appropriate amounts. And if we look at it from the standpoint of the full system, you're thinking, okay, looking at the physiology of the stress response system, we know that we're looking at more the controlling the pathway from upstream than just the release of cortisol downstream, or lack thereof. So, really we should, in my opinion, use the term HPA axis function or dysfunction, or even the term maladaption, is a more appropriate way of describing the consequences of, explaining how stress affects the body as a system. And it comes down to, we take all these really complicated medical topics and physiological processes, and we try to simplify them so it makes sense. But in doing so, we actually lose the deeper meaning over time. And then you kind of, need to take that step back and say, okay, well, is it really adrenal fatigue or adrenal exhaustion? Or is it, looking at the whole physiology of the system and saying, like, how often do we really have Addison's or Cushing's disease, right? Like these are opposite extreme, like hyper or hypocortisol situations. And, they're opposite extremes and they happen like less than 1% of the time or something crazy. So we want to look at like everything in between, and we're not prescribing cortisol and we're not removing the adrenal gland. So like, what are we doing? There isn't really like a prescription for this. Right. And so like, if you look at it from a functional standpoint, it's like, how can we help this system? If we're not going to prescribe something, like testing cortisol, typically if you go into a primary care's office, my understanding is that you would get, and this is actually my experience too, and I loved my primary care, so I'm not saying anything other than, like, I went in and I was like, man, I don't feel well. What's happening to me? Clearly we start studying these things because we've been through them ourselves or we know somebody who has, right? Um, so I went in and I, finally had a one serum cortisol, so a blood sample taken in the morning when I got my thyroid tested as well, and all my other like foundational blood work. And it was like, yeah, I mean, you probably don't have anything, but it's a little high, so we're going to send you for, more testing. Well, after a while, and I wasn't really getting any better, I was eating healthy, I was physically active, going through all these things. When you look at like, oh yeah, my blood sugar might have been a little off, but I was eating healthy. So where was that coming from? Like, it was stress on my body from different avenues that it was causing small little things that made me think something was wrong. And that one cortisol sample wasn't cutting it to give the full picture of what was happening with my entire stress response system. So that's when I started seeking out like a functional medicine practitioner. Being a practitioner myself, I'm going, why can't I figure out what's wrong with me? Do I need more amino acids? Do I need to do more yin yoga? Like, do I need to meditate? Like, what's happening? And so that's when I really dove into how functional medicine practitioners test cortisol and looking into that as well. So I kind of like extrapolated, but yeah, I mean, you're looking at the upstream system to understand the whole thing in between those two extremes, basically.
So
that was my point. Sorry.
I love your point. Your point was great. And I like your story about you because I have the same or a very similar story. So so when you test for HPA axis dysfunction, you know, there's lots of different ways to do that, right? We can do a morning cortisol and then we can see what it is. And, before 9 a.m., we could do a salivary cortisol, over a 5-point, which is the whole day, and in the middle of the night. Do you find that either one is more beneficial than the other, I guess is the first question. Do you feel like you can really almost, for lack of like wanting to, shun my lab people, but do you feel like you can really diagnose someone with what I would say an HP axis dysfunction or external stressors without necessarily having the cortisol confirmation?
Okay, so you're saying, can I do it without testing?
Yeah, can you do it without? I mean, do you feel that you can really make that diagnosis without testing? And if you can, okay, perfect. If not, do you feel like we need a saliva or do we have to do a 5-point? Do you feel like that's the best way to really get a curve? Just kind of curious on your opinion.
So I talk to practitioners that do both, and I find the most successful practitioners do the salivary testing with cortisol awakening response.
Yep.
So in the very least 5-point. I do have practitioners that look at the symptoms. We are playing a little bit more of the trial and error game when we do that, right? Yep. So we're looking at it like, okay, what is causing your anxiety or your fatigue? Is it high or low cortisol? Is it neurotransmitters? Is it blood sugar? Is it sex hormones? Like, gosh, wouldn't it be nice if we could just get all those and measure them and see what the problem is, and then we know exactly. So yeah, we can do it with a questionnaire and try to figure out like, where are your major stressors coming from, right? Is it your blood sugar? Do you have a lot of emotional stress going on in your life with, work or family or finances or whatever, the big three, right? Do you have inflammation from somewhere like your gut or, other, like, did you have your hip replaced, whatever, like what else is going on in your system, which sometimes can lead to infections as well. And then, or like, how are you sleeping? And then it's, why aren't you sleeping if that's the problem? Like, is it self-induced sleep hygiene kind of stuff? Like, do we need to look at, your bedroom temperature, your activities 2 hours before bed as far as blue light and eating and that kind of stuff? Is it trouble falling or staying asleep, whatever? So yeah, I mean, we can figure out some of it through asking questions, either a questionnaire or just talking to the patient in you know, in conversation. But yeah, it is really nice to get to get that. I actually will look at some practitioners cortisol results, and I'll be asking them questions that they're like, oh, I didn't think about asking that question. That's really interesting. Like, what time are they eating? Oh, this person must be a shift worker because this is when they're waking up, right? Like, I can tell a lot from a patient if I see their cortisol results, and I look at it from the perspective of like, yeah, it's really cool to see where their cortisol is. So then I know I can, like if you look at a diurnal pattern, which is the four samples during the day, which would be, the salivary sample immediately when you wake up, another one basically lunch, dinner, and bedtime, right? So those four, if I look at those, I can say, if you have a spike or a crash, what are you eating? If you have high cortisol at night, what's happening when you come home from work? Is that the only time you eat a meal? Because there are people in professions that don't eat until they get home at night and they eat one big meal, or they eat, are they stressed out because they've got dinner to prepare, homework to get done with their kids, everything to get ready for the next day? Because I always call these people like my working moms, right? Like, they've got all the things to do for the next day and all the things to do when they get home, and they've got work to think about and all of that. So, is that why your cortisol is going up? Like, let's do some lifestyle management stuff. So, or there's like, we call them bookends. If you're really high cortisol in the morning and really high cortisol at night, let's look at your gut. Let's start diving deeper into if you have some gut infections or parasites or something, like, so there's a lot you can tell from that. And then the patterns and the spikes and the crashes and getting into cortisol awakening response. Those are the 3 morning salivary samples. And so personally, I would prefer to see a cortisol awakening response with the diurnal pattern, because I'm needy. I want to see what's happening. Yeah, like honestly, it's really super interesting because they'll do those 3 morning samples. So you'll give a patient a tube, and they'll do the saliva sample immediately when they wake up, and then they'll set before they brush their teeth, they drink water. That's it, all we let you do. And then we'll have them set an alert and do another sample in 30 minutes, and then another sample 30 minutes after that. So it'll be like 0, 30, 60 from awakening. And then we'll do an afternoon and an evening, or maybe we'll do a lunch, afternoon, and evening. It depends on who you test through, and what you're kind of looking for. But yeah, that cortisol awakening response, we abbreviate it to CAR, and CAR indicates, really it's how robust your stress response is. It gives you that knowledge of basically kind of where you are in your oxidative stress and leading potentially to chronic disease. There is information in the research that talks about cortisol awakening response being used as an oxidative stress marker now, actually, like right along with like high sensitivity C-reactive protein and LDL and all that stuff. So it's kind of interesting where you can kind of see like how far along the stress continuum is your patient. And it also is a great indicator of like how long it's going to take them to get better, right? So if their CAR is like very high in the morning, it has like this great spike and then it comes back down, you look at that person as having like really high perceived stress. So they're waking up and they're already like ramped up for the day. So that they have quite a bit going on. Their brain's already functioning before they even wake up. It might even wake them up earlier than they would want to be awakened, and they wake up with maybe even anxiety.
Right.
But if their cortisol awakening response is low and it doesn't ramp up like that, then you're looking at somebody who, wow, you're pretty far into this kind of chronic stress. You might not be able to ramp a stress response at all, even, if somebody comes up and scares you, or, you might have zero reaction. You might be super docile, and that's not good either. Right. And that really gives an indication of, them. It's going to take longer to fix those people, because we need to fix, maybe some precursor nutrients. We need to re-regulate the stress response in general. So I like to get both, because it gives me a good indication of where they are with that daytime, morning cortisol awakening. And then the diurnal cortisol during the day gives me the cool pattern of like, oh, what else do you have going on?
Right. And just to kind of put this out there, because I do get this question a lot. This isn't something that, our regular labs in the area typically do. It's one that we kind of send out. It's a saliva test that we give you and you send out. So it's not done at, your local, and I'm not going to use names, but your local labs. That it's a functional medicine, integrative medicine lab that does these tests stuff for you for the most part. So we do have that for our patients. And I have to agree with you. I love seeing the curves. It tells a lot about a patient that maybe you don't always get in an interview. So I want to take that a step further. You mentioned, well, there's two ways to go with this. You mentioned recovery time, and I think it's super important to talk about recovery time um, with HPA axis dysfunction. But also, I just want to touch on insulin resistance, because I think that metabolic dysfunction and HPA axis aren't talked about enough. And, everyone just, loves to say to me, oh, it's genetic, my sugars are going up. Oh, well, and I think it's so important to discuss this as, gut dysfunction, insulin dysregulation, hormone imbalance, as you go through menopause and hormone changes, how that really does affect insulin. So
Mhm.
if you want to just touch on that a little bit, and then I want to talk about how long it takes to get better.
Yeah. So cortisol is a glucocorticoid, and it regulates metabolism and, the immune response as well. So, like you said, if there's like gut infections, any infection, really systemic, inflammation of any kind from any reason. But yeah, it does help control the blood sugar. And so what happens is, if you're having high blood sugar, like these high spikes from meals, or you're going into kind of a blood sugar low or crash, either after a high sugar meal, high processed food meal, or because you skipped a meal, your body is going to respond and say, okay, I don't want you to pass out. I want you to have blood sugar in a normal range between 70 to 100, because I want you to stay alive, right? Again, it's our stress response hormone. It's going to keep us alive. It's survival. So what happens is it recognizes that we have this low blood sugar, and our body will release it in a stress response manner in order to basically release stores of glucose. We call it glycogen is the stored form of glucose, and that's found in our liver. That's how we store our sugar, basically, in the form of glycogen. And so it's a process called gluconeogenesis. So gluco-neo means new, and genesis means a process to create. So we create glucose from our glycogen stores to increase our blood glucose levels. And so that's awesome, because our body naturally maintains homeostasis, which is like our ability to, like, if something's low, we bring it up to normal. If it's something's high, we bring it back down to normal, right? Like we have these set ranges. I always kind of describe it to my patients as like a thermostat in a furnace or an AC unit, right? Like if it's too hot in your house, the thermostat's the detector that detects that, and it turns on the air conditioning to bring the temperature down, and vice versa with the thermos and it being too cold. So our body does that and maintains that with all these different processes, our thyroid, our blood sugar, you know, all that stuff. So that's kind of the mechanism behind it. And what ends up happening is if we do this too often over time, we'll actually overshoot sometimes, and then we'll have way too much, and then we have to release insulin. I'm saying we have too much glucose in our blood, and then we have to release insulin in order to help uptake our glucose into our cells to utilize it. And when we have this process happening all the time, like high blood sugar, low blood sugar, insulin, cortisol, we start having this metabolic mess of you know, it's like tug of war, right? And then that's what will lead to our insulin resistance. So do you have more to add to that?
Oh, that was a perfect explanation. I think what people need to understand is that the stressors in our life, and people ask like where you let off what stressors are, and I like how you put them into buckets because I tend to do the same thing. You know, it could just be chronic gut inflammation, like foods irritate you all the time, or food sensitivities, or maybe you have a bug that we haven't found, or maybe it's just stress in your life, or you're not sleeping. All these things can elevate or eventually decrease cortisol levels and can have a significant effect on um, your insulin and your sugar levels, which can lead to fatigue or not utilizing your sugars appropriately, and long term, obviously, diabetes, and can definitely exacerbate it. Um, so no, I think that's perfect. And I think by that same token, we need to remind people that that takes a really long time to happen. It doesn't generally happen overnight. This process is months to years, right? Unless you were in the ICU and you were super sick and your body was under tremendous amounts of stress for whatever reason, generally, or car accidents and that kind of thing. Generally speaking, it takes a long time to get there. And I think by the same token, what you'll most likely agree with me is it takes a long time to recover. um, so I just got a question. So if you do have HPA axis dysfunction, what can you do to make it better if there's no prescription? Um, so I think that we can talk about that for maybe. I know we can go brief. We don't have to go crazy. Give them some basic things. Obviously, there's a couple things I love. I'll throw those out there.
Yeah.
Meditation, right? One of the most proven, data driven ways to decrease cortisol levels over time. Um, and now that we have apps and phones and everything, it's so easy to do 5 to 10 minutes of meditation a day. Um, there's obviously, we can replace a lot of the nutrients that are sometimes missing, which is why cortisol becomes what I call overdrive, or too high or too low. We can start replacing those and fixing the gut and healing up the gut, which I almost always start at gut. To me, the gut immune inflammation system is so strong that it almost, to me, I call it the overriding pyramid. It literally is probably the one that's affecting you the most 9 times out of 10. So we do a lot of gut, maybe some food avoidance, but a lot of gut healing. And um, so the other thing I do is probably some, depending on which end of the spectrum you're on, calming herbs. There's tons of calming herbs to help obviously shut the system down a bit. And by the same token, there's glandulars, which are literally, I always say they're extracts from an animal, from the adrenal gland, that pump it the other direction, right? That help to raise it. So there are supplements that I find can help a lot. I think lifestyle modification is one of the biggest things you can do, especially as an athlete. Um, Rest, time, meditation, stretching, recovery are huge. I'm actually a big believer in actually not having a huge glycogen store too. I don't know how you feel about that, Stacy, but if you kind of get off the sugar and deplete a lot of the glycogen that's in your system and start working off of more of a fat-based system, you'll find that the cortisol levels regulate a lot more easily as well. I don't know, what did I miss, Stace?
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, like admitting that this could be a problem, right? Like step one. Um, two, like you said, you like I normally tell patients, look, the Great Wall of China was not built in a day, right?
My dad.
So it took you a long time to get here, and it's maybe gonna take I usually tell them at least double the time. So if you've been under stress for 6 months, it's probably going to take you a year. If you've been under stress for 5 years, I'm not going to say it's going to take you 10 years, but it's going to take a while. I have patients that work on this for 2 to 5 years. And the other caveat to that is that in a perfect world, right? Like if you live in a bubble and or you live on a cloud in the sky with rainbows and butterflies and little bluebirds singing above your head like Snow White, you're going to get better in a timely fashion. But if you are still being exposed to stress, whether it's an infection in your system that we need to manage, if it's mental and emotional stress, whatever your diet is, wherever we've determined that your stress is coming from, those are the things you need to work on. So absolutely, meditation, like you said, is very well researched and proven, and there's tons of apps. Breathing exercises can be very helpful, especially if people have anxiety. Just mindful eating is a big one too. I mentioned Epsom salt baths earlier, like you said, for athletes, but just in general can be helpful. A lot of people are magnesium deficient anyway.
On
So
on that note, when I tell people, Epsom salt, it's not a couple teaspoons, guys.
oh
Like,
yeah.
I get that a lot. "Oh, I put salt in my bath." I said, "No, you need, like, several cups." There's actually a lot of recipes out there. We can pull you up a million of them, but it's cups of Epsom salts because magnesium is
Yeah.
very calming, right? So, um,
Yeah.
yeah, even if you just put your
Absolutely. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And to that point also, then, what calms you? Water, um, nature sounds, certain smells like essential oils. If you don't like lavender, peppermint stimulating, but maybe you like minty things better. I don't know. Like whatever brings you joy are things that we need to do for ourselves. Like if you like dancing, let's get Sean T hip hop abs. That was the one I started with years and years ago, and all my friends made fun of me, but I was like, you know what, I like dancing. I was in jazz and tap and ballet when I was a kid, and it brings me joy. So make fun of me all you want, but I'm gonna do my exercise, like whatever.
right.
Music, listening to music, playing music unless it frustrates you, you know just finding a group community is huge too, right? Like maybe you join a book group. I joined a book group at one point, and so I got shamed for not reading the book, and I listened to the audiobook. But I didn't fib about it. I let them shame me, but it was fun because we had um uh a dinner and we talked about the book and we got together once a month, like whatever you enjoy.
Right.
If you need to make a list, make a list. Find things, you know journaling might be helpful for some people. um
Yeah, I actually encourage my patients to daily journal because I feel like there's certain things in their lives that they'll figure out are causing stress that they didn't realize until they start journaling.
yeah,
Um,
yeah, and that's it, find your triggers.
during COVID, that was a big thing for my patients. I feel like they had
Mm,
such monotony in their lives. I'm actually going to trigger that to COVID for a minute because we have about
yeah.
I think. And
Okay.
I just want to give like a brief discussion about, and I'll start it off because I love to talk about this, and I feel like COVID, and I have a lot of post-COVID patients right now, and I think that this HPA axis dysfunction is key to understanding chronic inflammation and what I would call just chronic body dysfunction. Let's just call it what it is because it's one of the most central processes in our body. Um, when we have a disease, and if it's COVID, fine, and I see it a lot with Lyme, then what happens is our bodies are turned on all the time. Our immune system is going crazy. Our gut could have started it. Who knows, right? It could have started as inflammation in the gut. Then you get a bug, and then it starts this cascade effect of chronic inflammation. And you might not know it as anything that you feel until it becomes a symptom, right? Until it becomes something that you're like, man, I my stomach hurts all the time when I eat, or I have this brain fog that's irretractable. It won't go away. Headaches that I can't get rid of. And, again, it took us, gosh, probably 15, 20 years to realize Lyme had all these prolonged effects. And you can argue what you want about Lyme and whether we get rid of it or not. Or so I'm not going to go down that route right now. But I think if we can all agree that there are prolonged neurologic and prolonged musculoskeletal effects from Lyme disease. And we can even argue that there's prolonged HPA axis dysfunction from Lyme and other metabolic dysregulation. So I'm finding in labs and in my patients that very similar things are coming post COVID. And it can be people that were not sick at all. Maybe they had a cough, some sneeze, runny nose. And I will tell you, almost universally low cortisol levels, high CRPs, low complement, which is a cell that fights infection. Just like in Lyme, they actually go down because they're consumed, right? They're basically bound and they're busy, and you can't find them. And the other crazy thing is almost everyone is complaining of digestive issues. I would say 95% of these people are complaining, man, I really didn't have a bad gut. Like maybe I had some food issues. Everybody thinks irritable bowel is normal in the United States anyway. Right? It's like, oh,
Yeah. Oh yeah.
I just have IBS. Okay.
I just have IBS. Oh, is it IBS?
Right.
Yes, for
Well, yeah.
sure. It's
And
IBS and all the other things.
what is IBS? Okay. So anyway, I just feel like that is such a it's almost like, to me, if we're going to look for the common link, I think a lot of it is gut disorder and probably some HPA axis dysfunction before they get sick. They get COVID, and then it's like the straw that broke the camel's back, right? It's that last thing that just said, wow, I can't keep up with the demand anymore. Again, you're robbing Peter to pay Paul, and they get all these downstream effects. So, all right, I'm going to throw the ball in your court.
Yeah. So I mean, to that point, if you're looking at, we've always known if somebody gets a flu virus, or if they get sick, or they have a traumatic brain injury, they get in a car accident, whatever, this could potentially spark the immune system into a type of autoimmunity. And actually, HPA axis dysfunction in stage 3, we really consider it as an autoimmune condition, right? Like, this is where we talk about, like, oh well, intermittent fasting is so great, and I don't know how how you talk to your patients about it, but when I have a stage 3 HPA axis patient, I'm like, well, we're not gonna start there, right? Like, we're gonna start with just cleaning up your diet. And this kind of leads me into the whole concept of, like, chicken or the egg, right? Like, were you susceptible, and then you got this, and then it made it worse, and it creates this vicious cycle. So we don't know what your terrain was before, but we know what your terrain is now, and we know these infections, wherever they come from, they cause inflammation and immune response. And HPA axis stimulation in the stress response causes, in turn, then dysbiosis. It causes inflammation. It causes secretory IgA imbalances, and then you get gut permeability, leaky gut, hyperpermeability, whatever you want to call it. Where then you're more prone to more infections. So it decreases GI motility, right? So, even you're looking at all these patients then potentially leading into other gut issues and bacterial overgrowth. You just become more susceptible. So that's kind of how it will go into, like, gut issues cause inflammation, cause HPA axis dysfunction, which then in turn causes more gut issues, like we just talked about: dysbiosis, inflammation, leaky gut, more infection. So you go into this sad vicious cycle. But touching on the immune system, um, elevated and prolonged stress, no matter what it's from, right? Like if it's from these infections, it then in turn disrupts immune function. So, we're talking about inhibiting immune cells and functions of like lymphocytes and macrophages and leukocytes. And at the same time, stress can cause the decrease of production of many of the cytokines and other mediators of inflammatory molecules. So, in a nutshell, chronic stress alters the body's ability to fend off infection and inflammation by limiting these key pieces of the immune system, as well as debilitating some of them. So, we do kind of create this vicious cycle. And then, if you want to get into inflammation systemically and in general over a long period of time, will then go into causing the microglial cells to jump into action in the brain.
You actually stole the thunder.
What's that?
You stole the thunder. Keep going.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry. Yeah. So
No,
so then that promotes phagocytosis and more like antibody antigen responses. And then it depends on like what tissue becomes involved, right? So if it's like your basal ganglia, then you might get something like Panzer pandas, which is the infection that induced autoimmune conditions that disrupts normal neurologic function. And that can lead to like obsessive compulsive disorder, motor function tics and stuff like that. Or maybe it affects your cerebellum. And you start getting some sort of like gait disorder. You start having difficulty swallowing or talking, and your coordination suffers, and it can affect your different neurotransmitters as well, and other cell types, which leads you to more weakness and fatigue and neuron fatigue and so on.
I actually found a new lab that's great, and we have about 3 minutes, just FYI.
Oh, okay.
That's all good. But there's a new lab that I've been using a lot, and I found that there's some amazing neuroantibodies that I've been running on people to get a better idea of where we're going with with these disease processes, right? Like what is the long term or down, how do we stop this antibody response? And that's really what we're trying to do, right? We're trying to shut off this antigen antibody response, which you're calling, the autoimmunity, right? Your stage 3ers or now that we're talking about neuroantibodies, I mean, to me, it's this crazy continuum that just gets worse. But I'm actually finding some really good lab data to track these kind of things. And we're not just talking about COVID, to back up, with a traumatic brain injury or even people that have other types of HPA axis dysfunction. I'm actually starting to run those neuro antibodies on these patients and really finding some fascinating results. And working on trying to get that test to come up negative, 6 months, a year, you're right, a year to 2 years down the line, once we start shutting down that autoimmune response. It's really interesting. So, I know it's super controversial, guys, and I kind of like to be on the fringe anyway. So, I think that what we're going to find using all this information that Stacey gave us is we're all under a ton of stress right now. Even if you're working from home and you think life is easier, it's just different. And we need to think about what that's doing to our HPA axis and whether we're talking about COVID's direct effect on it or what we had going on before COVID. I think it's just important to understand that I joke there's two arms of people. There's people that got skinny during COVID and there's people that gained weight during COVID, right? And you either went out and you worked out like crazy or you were not going to the gym and you were cooking all the time and you're trying new foods and sitting home with your family and eating. And either direction you went could cause an HPA axis dysfunction, right? So I think that we really need to look at cortisol more critically when it comes to disease. And I always say gut immune inflammation, and I love bugs. But I think that this really brings it relevant to COVID and making sure that we understand, yes, we might have had COVID mildly, right? It might not have been a big deal, but people are having tons of downstream effects from this. And With the last 30 seconds, I'm going to say, Stacey, you are amazing. Lots of perfect information, the great amount of medical terminology. If anybody has any questions, they can reach out to me on info@mydrlori.com. I can also patch in Stacey too. We can just kind of tag her in some of these emails and ask her some questions. She's great at education. And if you want to work on your HPA axis, you can get some supplements at mydrlori.com, mydrlori.com. And with that, have a great night, guys. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
All clear. Great job, everyone.
Thank you.
Take care, doctor. I will
Awesome.
see you next week.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Stace, thank you. That was awesome. Let me just.
Yeah.